So this is crazy. Imagine you're the most dominant player in the game. You're so dominant that nobody even questions it. Nobody's willing to challenge you because they know that if they do, they're going to lose. But one day you wake up and you decide, hey, just for fun, I'm not only going to challenge the number 2 player, but I'm going to challenge everybody. Not only am I going to challenge them, I'm going to bully them into playing the game the way I want it to be played. But you realize quickly that there's a catch. All the cards that you thought you held, it turns out you don't actually hold. And at the same time that you're realizing that you don't have the dominance that you thought you did, everybody else is realizing it as well. This is exactly what's happening right now with the US and the trade war that it's fighting with China. And in a scenario where just a few months ago, the US seemed to have all the global economic cards, it turns out they don't. Because over the last 20 years, they gave up an important thing, and that was their leverage. And even though nobody asked if the US actually still had that leverage, they made a fatal mistake that showed everybody their hand and could reshape the global economic order as we know it. Because it turns out that the US is never going to beat China in a trade war. And I'm going to reveal why the US has played all its cards and why China now has the upper hand, making it potentially the next global superpower. But in order to understand how we got here, we need to take a little bit of a look at history, because there was a beginning to the end, a significant mistake that the US made that essentially rolled out the red carpet, so to speak, for China to establish, at least in theory, global dominance. And while nobody thought that this would play out so soon and so quickly, the US made a fatal mistake going to war, in a trade war with China, where it turns out China actually holds all the cards, primarily because of something that the US encouraged China to do. And that was to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, at the time, encouraging China to join the WTO seemed like a good idea. The US hoped that it would create economic integration and political reform, making China a little less communist and maybe a little bit more democratic. You see that they thought opening up China from a trade perspective would also open them up politically, but it didn't. And this was a turning point that would eventually lead the US to a perilous position, one where they thought they had all the cards but obviously didn't, one where they would pick a fight that they couldn't win, where China could just retaliate and retaliate and retaliate with almost zero concern for their own economic well-being, while at the same time putting the US at a significant disadvantage, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about the impact that China joining the WTO had on trade with America. Because in the early 2000s, the US only imported about $100 billion worth of goods. But over the next 20 years, that number would increase to over $500 billion worth of goods. But while the US outsourced manufacturing to China and started importing a significant amount of goods, China didn't buy as much from the US as the US was buying from them, which led ultimately to a pretty significant trade deficit. But it also led to one other major problem, and that was the fact that the US, having outsourced most of its manufacturing to China, now was kind of in a position where they didn't have the tools they needed to produce the things that they potentially needed at home, putting them at the mercy of China without even realizing it. At this point, they essentially gave away all of their leverage if they were ever to get into any sort of war or trade war with the nation that was across the Pacific. And this has become known as the China shock, where Chinese exports exploded after 2001. And at the same time, it's estimated that somewhere between 500,000 and 2.4 million jobs were erased from the American economy. Now, these were manufacturing jobs. And unfortunately, while the overall impact of more trade with China was a net benefit to the entirety of the United States, there were certain areas of the country that were more impacted than others by jobs moving overseas. So most of this new trade that had a net benefit to the US as a whole was at the expense of certain local markets. And by the way, those certain local markets, well, they kind of have a pretty big say when it comes to voting. And even though most of the rest of the world doesn't remember that these jobs were lost and certain industries were impacted, the people that were impacted, well, they certainly have a memory that goes back 10 to 20 years. Which, when all of this China stuff started getting politicized in 2016, was the reason why Donald Trump, on his first and second term, well, was able to get voted in by those states that had been affected by the China shock. And all it took was the suggestion that jobs needed to come back to the US in order to make that happen. But the question is, how easy is it for those jobs to return? And the answer is, well, it's highly unlikely. You could probably bring the manufacturing back to the US, but if you bring it back to the US, it's probably going to be automated in such a way that those jobs will never re exist. The onshoring of manufacturing might be something that's possible in 3 to 5 years, but the return of the jobs, well, it's highly unlikely. But nonetheless, China joining the WTO showed that there were significant cracks in the system. The first was that there was persistently a US trade deficit with China, which makes sense in a lot of ways when you are the world's most prosperous country and you have the most money to spend and you're consuming the most, you're probably going to be consuming goods from other suppliers and other countries. But there was more to it than just that. There was also the accusations of currency manipulation, China making its goods cheaper by manipulating its own currency. There was the unfair subsidies that were being given to Chinese companies to make them more competitive in the international market. And there was the fact that state owned enterprises dominated the Chinese manufacturing world, which made it really hard for countries elsewhere to compete, whether they were American or otherwise. So, even though China joining the WTO and significantly more trade with China was a net benefit to Americans, the memories were still there. And that combined with Americans taking exception to Chinese manufacturers breaking the rules led the US to do something that they probably shouldn't have done. And that was fight back, to challenge the second place player at a game where they were already dominant, were already winning, and potentially, if they made the wrong move, could show the entire world that they weren't the dominant player that everybody thought they were. And this started in 2018 with Trump's first trade war with China. And as Trump took up a fight with US manufacturers, China turned around and took up a fight with US farmers, meaning that an industry, a group of people that weren't in a fight, were all of a sudden brought into a fight. And that should have been the first sign that picking a fight with China was not a good idea, because it could lead to collateral damage in industries that had nothing to do with the trade war to begin with. Manufacturing jobs get destroyed, US goes to war with China, China destroys farmers. Now you've got two industries that are destroyed instead of just one. Now, this was mostly settled, but fast forward 5 years, and here we are once again. This all starts in February 2025 with a 10% tariff being reintroduced to multiple countries. Then in March, it increases to 20%. And this is all framed as a fentanyl issue. It's a drug issue. It's national security. But it's not. It's an attempt to reshape the world order. A world order where the US is the dominant country and expects to continue to be, but uses that power to bully other nations, only to find out that the power it thought it had, well, it wasn't actually there. And that's where we end up in April of 2025. The US realizing that it doesn't have the power it thought it did, and that other countries, especially China, aren't backing down. Because as this is all happening, China starts to realize that it actually holds a lot more cards than it originally thought it did. And as this tit for tat war plays out, you see the US impose 10% tariffs. Then it increases them to 20. And China just sits on the sidelines and goes, okay, whatever. But then all of a sudden, the US raises tariffs, another 34%. And China goes, okay, you know what? We've had enough. We're going to retaliate. So they put 34% tariffs on the US. The US, Donald Trump says, don't do that. You're going to regret it. If you don't pull back those tariffs, you're going to be in trouble. And we're going to increase tariffs another 50%. Well, China doesn't back down. So tariffs go up another 50%. And at the end of the day, we end up in a situation where the US now has 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, and China has 125% tariffs on US goods. And they basically said, this is as far as we're going to go, at least with respect to tariffs, because there's no point in it going any further. The amount that we have increased tariffs against each other has pretty much destroyed all trade that we're going to do. They've basically said to the US, increase the tariffs as much as you want, because there's a point where it doesn't matter. And when we get to that point, what you're going to realize is that you need us more than we need you. And this is where you see the breaking point. We're at all-out war with one of our biggest trading partners, and without a doubt, one of the most significant suppliers of goods to the US consumer. And the WTO estimates that this is going to reduce trade between the US and China by up to 80%. But worse than that, it's going to fragment trade along geopolitical lines, meaning that China and the East is probably going to take its ball and go home and leave the West to figure out stuff on their own. And there's a huge problem with this, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. but it has to do with the control that China has of some pretty important products and also some pretty important resources. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the impacts that these tariffs are going to have to the Chinese economy. Because when tariffs went up by 50%, it meant that China's economy was probably going to shrink about 1.5%. But then when the tariffs went up to 125%, well, the amount of damage that the additional tariffs did was not quite as significant, leading to only a 2.2% reduction in GDP. In economics, this is called diminishing returns. So the first 50 basis points in tariffs did a significant amount of damage, or potentially did a significant amount of damage. But every additional 50 basis points from there does less and less damage because the damage is already done. And while it seems like going from 145% to 300% would be damaging, the reality is you can't kill something that's already dead. The US, by imposing the tariffs, basically killed trade with China, and increasing them any further has pretty much no effect, except for the fact that it gets significantly harder for the US consumer to get the goods that they want to buy at the prices they want to buy them at. But that's not even the biggest problem, because China has an upper hand. And nobody realized this until Donald Trump went to war with China. And that upper hand actually has very little to do with China and has more to do with the weakness of the US economy that nobody even realized was there. And that structural weakness was threefold. First, it's how much people underestimated the US consumers' reliance on cheap goods from overseas, especially from China. Two, it is the US's hollowed out manufacturing base. Donald Trump is absolutely correct in suggesting that the US needs to bring manufacturing back home. Unfortunately, what he doesn't realize is that it needs to be done gradually. Because if you lose your biggest supplier pretty much overnight, but it takes 3 to 5 years to build out the factories that you need to build the products that you want to build, well, you're going to have a pretty significant amount of pain over several years. And the third was the dependency that US companies have on foreign supply chains, because a lot of what's made in USA is also made abroad before it's assembled in the USA. But that's not even China's biggest advantage here. It's the reordering of global trade that is going to be so important. But before we talk about that, let's talk about who is actually going to get hurt in the US. Because for the most part, it's going to be first and foremost consumers. There's going to be price spikes, there's going to be inflation as a result of higher tariffs, higher costs, and having to buy goods from countries that aren't China, that, by the way, are going to see the writing on the wall and the opportunity to raise prices on US consumers primarily because they'll be able to. If you can't buy Chinese goods for the same prices you used to, in fact, you're going to have to buy them for 145% more than you did previously. Well, that gives other countries around the world the ability to increase prices, and they don't even have to increase them the full 145%. They can increase them 100% and it'll still be a better deal than the Chinese products. But the price for US consumers still goes up. Then there's the impact to US small businesses who don't have the ability to trade with pretty much anybody. They're going to see prices rise as well. In fact, what you're probably going to see because of the higher prices, if they do happen, is a lot of small businesses going out of business because they won't be able to compete with bigger manufacturers or foreign manufacturers from countries that aren't China. And here's the big one. The people that are going to feel the most impact are probably the farmers, who at this point have pretty much lost all access to the Chinese market. This is going to be devastating to local farmers who relied on that market for trade. Oh, and don't even get me started on manufacturers who aren't going to be able to pivot fast enough. The idea that Apple, for example, is going to be able to bring the production of iPhones back to the US in a quick manner is ridiculous. No, instead, what they're probably going to do is they're probably going to ramp up the production in India instead, or move production to Vietnam or to other countries that aren't China. They aren't going to onboard them and bring them back to the US. They're just going to move them to other countries that have the capacity that aren't in a trade war with the US. And the US government has already realized that this is a problem. As of this filming, just hours before, the US pulled back all the tariffs on computers and electronics, primarily because they realized that something like the iPhone would go up in price by up to 3x if they continued down the path that they were on. But that doesn't mean that China is going to back down just because the US lowered the tariffs on electronics. No, China has made it very clear that they are willing to fight till the bitter end. And importantly, what they've realized is that they've actually got some leverage that they didn't realize that they had. because China's essentially built an economic fortress. Now, whether it was because they did shady things when it came to trade that other countries couldn't do or not, it doesn't matter. They're the world's #1 manufacturer. That gives them leverage. They are the dominant player in global exports. That gives them leverage. They have a massive domestic industrial base. In other words, all the factories, all the machinery, everything's already there. That gives them leverage. And they've also got one of the biggest populations, if not the biggest population in the world. Sorry, I should probably have that data on hand as I'm making this video, but I don't. But nonetheless, their internal demand is definitely a significant benefit. And there's things that they can do in order to increase the internal domestic demand as well, by doing things like, I don't know, printing money and stimulating the economy, which puts them at an even greater advantage when it comes to this trade war. But on top of that, they've also got supply chain control. A lot of goods that are made in other countries have some sort of tie to the Chinese economy. There are 80 plus product categories that rely on China. And a lot of those categories, a lot of the most significant categories, are things that the world needs to move forward in order to lessen their reliance on oil. Things like rare earth metals, electric vehicles, solar panels. These are all areas where China has a near monopoly. And not only that, the production of things that go into these types of goods is already integrated in global production lines. There isn't a single vehicle on the planet that doesn't get some sort of product that comes directly from China. Whether it's made in the USA, made in Canada, made in Mexico, made in Germany, made elsewhere. Every single one of these production lines has some sort of component that relies on Chinese exports. And that's true not just for cars, but for a lot of goods that are produced and consumed by, you guessed it, US consumers and global consumers alike. But here's where it gets really scary, because we're already seeing regional alliances change. There's talks of strengthening a free trade agreement between South Korea, Japan, and China. We've already seen two of the US's most significant allies in Japan and South Korea, at least in Asia, start to have further conversations with China about how they can work together. So two partners of the US, who the US thought was its allies in these games, are starting to have conversations with the competitor. And these three countries alone have a combined GDP that is 22% of the global economy. And they combine for a total of 18.3% of world trade. And while these talks were happening prior to this, they literally hadn't had conversations about it in 5 years. But when the US decided to play this game and test its dominance, guess who started talking again? Now, Chinese state media suggested that China, Japan, and South Korea would jointly respond to US tariffs. And obviously, South Korea and Japan came back quickly and said this isn't true. But they did have a joint response, a joint press release from their meetings, which suggested that they were open to having more trade, as the US seemed to want to go into an isolationist stance. Basically, the US doing what it did led Japan and South Korea to go, hold on a second, we're not sure if our partner is going to be our partner, so maybe we should start talking to the other guy. And this is happening around the world. We're seeing Canada start to talk to the European Union about strengthening its trade relationships. We're seeing once reliable Asian trading partners start to talk to each other about how they can circumvent the US. And China's already the single biggest trading partner with Africa. And by the way, back when Donald Trump got elected, China saw all this coming. And guess what? They opened their doors, they opened their borders to these small nations, undeveloped nations, and said, hey, if you want a really reliable trading partner, we'll be that for you. Which is essentially China opening up to the world and saying, you know what? We're open for business. And it seems like the other big superpower, well, they're not. So would you like to deal with them, or would you like to deal with us? And this is how the world order gets rearranged. Now, as I mentioned, China saw this all coming. In 2018, the writing was on the wall. They realized really quickly in 2018 that they didn't want to have all their eggs in the US basket. So they spent the last 7 years preparing for something that really shouldn't have happened, but did. So let me show you how. First of all, there was a clear diversification of trade. The US said, we don't want to be trading only with China, so they reduced the amount of goods that they were importing. Well, at the same time, China reduced the amount that they were importing from the US as well. But as you'll see in a minute, China's trade actually went up significantly. Well, it stayed pretty much even with the US, meaning that they just diversified who they were trading with. which becomes a major problem for the United States. You'll see why in a second. And it turns out that the US needs Chinese exports more than China needs US imports. Over the last 20 years, China's share of US imports has gone up substantially. But the percentage of goods that are being bought by the US that China produces has gone down, meaning that China is exporting more and more to other countries that aren't the USA. And this becomes problematic for the US because China doesn't rely on the US to buy its goods, but the US very much relies on China to buy some pretty significant consumer products, which gives China an upper hand in this trade war. And where this gets really interesting is when you look at the difference in trade between 2018 and 2023. Because in 2018, the US bought 19.8% of Chinese exports. In 2023, they bought only 12.8%. Now, what's interesting is that the total amount of exports in 2018 from China was 2.76 trillion. In 2023, it was 3.42 trillion. So China exported significantly more, but the US's share of what they exported went down. And when we look at the nominal amount of this, what you can see is that in 2018, the United States imported from China about $547 billion in goods. In 2023, they only imported $436 billion worth of goods, which is about a $100 billion reduction in the amount that they've imported. But if the US is importing less from China, but China is exporting more to the global economy, what that means is that China is becoming an even bigger player, one that is way less reliant on the US than the US believes it is. And ironically, while all of this was happening, while the US was reducing the amount that it imports from China, Canada and Mexico were both increasing the amount that they imported from China, getting their hands on some of those cheap Chinese goods that Americans were importing less of. And as we get further and further into this US tariff issue, that's going to happen globally. Everyone is going to start buying goods from China that are cheaper because the US is no longer demanding them. And that is going to give China even more leverage on a global stage because the US is becoming isolationist. They're becoming erratic. In fact, by the time you watch this video, half of what I said could be totally different from the perspective of what the tariffs are. I mean, even this morning, as I was looking at the news, right before filming this, Trump had gone ahead and changed it so that electronics and computers weren't going to be tariffed anymore, which is essentially Donald Trump blinking in this whole trade war, going, you know what? China called my bluff, and now what am I going to do? I have to get rid of these tariffs on electronics because if I don't, well, prices are going to go up and the US consumer is going to hate me when they can't get their hands on that Samsung or that iPhone that they've always wanted or that they expect to be able to buy for X number of dollars, but it now costs 3 times that. And not only that, in the face of all this erratic behavior, China seems to be, at least on a global stage, the more reliable trading partner, which is causing the world order to realign. We're starting to see Asian countries that once had a very strong relationship with the US and not so much of a strong relationship with China start to rethink, their relationships with the Chinese government. And we're also seeing places like Canada rethink their relationship with the US and other potential trading partners around the world. And this leads us to a conversation around what would happen if the US and the China really did decouple. Who would face the biggest challenges and the most pain? Well, the US has fragile supply chains. We've already established this. Their manufacturing went to China, which means the supply chains are reliant on China. And if China goes away, well, we've got a 3 to 5 year problem of bringing manufacturing back home, which is probably something that doesn't make a lot of sense in the first place, especially when you start to realize the US's thought process around immigration and what you would need from an immigration perspective to fill all the jobs to manufacture all the things. And then on top of that, you've got this massive consumer impact. It's the consumer goods that are going to be most impacted by tariffs on China. Now, flip this around and look at the Chinese impact. And they've got resilient supply chains. They can make whatever they want for whoever they want. And on top of that, they've diversified their exports to other countries already. So, yeah, our 12% trading partner might buy less, but we can just sell those goods to other countries for less. And while there's some argument that that's not good for the world economy, the reality is China can survive. And when we put this into a apples to apples comparison, it looks like this. The manufacturing base in the US is weak and it's strong in China. Supply chains in the US are fragile and self sufficient in China. Consumer impact in the US is going to be high. In China, it's probably going to be pretty low. And the export diversification in the US, where we can send our goods, is, well, not that great. While in China, it's quite significant. And not only that, when you look at the goods that the US exports to China versus what China exports to the US, it becomes really clear that most of what China buys from the US is not for consumer use. Soybeans being the one that's closest to that. But it's mostly aircrafts and engines, integrated circuits, pharmaceuticals, and petroleum. On the other hand, what China exports to the US is things that people want to buy, that when they become more expensive are going to create pain for American consumers. Things like smartphones, laptops, batteries, not just for the things you use every day, but for things like electric vehicles that are becoming so popular, and then toys and telecom equipment. All of these things, when they go up in price, are going to affect the amount of money that you have available in your pocket to spend on a daily basis. These tariffs, believe it or not, are going to hurt you as a consumer more than they're going to hurt anybody else. And then when it comes to the sticker shock, this is where it gets really interesting because China exports pretty much everything that they export to the US to a significantly greater scale to other countries. The amount that China exports to the US is denoted by the black parts of the line. The amount that China exports elsewhere is the blue. There isn't a single product that China exports to the US that they don't export significantly more of to other countries. And when it comes to what the US exports to China, well, there's only one thing, one item that China relies on the US for, and that's jet engines. Everything else they import at a greater scale from other countries than they import from the US. So China, just like an individual, looked at this whole scenario in 2018 and said, hey, we need to diversify. And they did. And because they diversified, they were able to insulate themselves from this global competitor, this bully, this dominant player that other countries are now realizing as China stands up to them isn't as dominant as everybody thought. So let's talk about the winners versus losers in this whole trade war, because it's very clear that the US consumers are the people who are going to suffer the most. When China retaliates, it's US businesses that are going to feel the pain, not Chinese businesses, which in a lot of cases are government owned or government subsidized anyways. And China holds the keys to industrial inputs for things like solar panels, electric cars, batteries that the US needs. And there's not much of a chance the US is going to be able to get them if China's not exporting to them. So the question is, can this be reversed? I mean, reshoring, the idea that jobs are going to come back to the US and manufacturing is going to come back to the US, that's a 5 to 10 year project. And more than likely, it's my guess that most American companies are just going to wait 4 years until there's a new president to see what happens. And if they do end up reshoring the manufacturing of a lot of these products, guess what? They're probably going to use automation rather than people in order to do it, meaning that the amount of jobs that are going to return to the US is nowhere close to the amount of jobs that were lost during the China shock. And don't even get me started on US industrial policy and how fragmented that is and how we've pretty much just lost touch with what it means to be a producer. But here's the real consequence: a new global trade map. The US once being the epicenter, the biggest consumer, the customer that everybody wanted because they could spend the most. Now, in this crazy world where they've uncovered that they're no longer the dominant player and that some other countries hold some cards, well, all the other countries are going to look to this one player that's no longer reliable and say, maybe we don't want to get too invested with them and instead start trading around them. Canada could go to Europe and Australia, maybe even China and some other Asian countries to get their goods. They could even start exporting the goods that they export to the US to those countries as well, if it's mutually beneficial. China obviously has the entire world that they can export to, so they're probably not concerned. There might be a little bit of a short-term pain, but in the end, it's probably going to be long-term gain, especially if they start to rise to a dominant position. And the only people that end up losing in this entire situation are the American citizens, because the dominant player, the one that didn't have to prove that they were dominant, all they had to do was keep playing the game and let everyone else be afraid of them. Well, they went too far. And when you go too far, you play your cards and you start to show people that maybe there's some flaws in your thinking. And you start to realize that maybe some of those flaws were things you didn't even realize were there, like your inability to manufacture goods for yourself, which makes it so that you are at the mercy of the country you're going to pick a fight with. Well, maybe that ends up being the thing that cements your legacy as the last great global superpower. But nonetheless, this is all real interesting. I don't think the US can win this trade war with China. I think the only thing that is possible is that they both back down and try to find some common ground once again, like they did in the early 2000s. And if they can do that, then everything will mostly go back to normal, although not entirely. But if they don't, and the US China trade relationship is severed, well, it could get significantly worse. And the problem could no longer be economic, but it could end up being military or worse. So let's hope that everybody comes to their senses on this whole thing, puts away their economic weapons, and ultimately finds a way to trade freely and constructively instead of doing whatever the heck it is they're doing right now. Oh, and by the way, if you want to see what always happens before a superpower falls, make sure you check out this video right here.